It all began in a quiet suburban neighborhood where most residents lived in harmony, at least on the surface. The houses were nearly identical, the lawns meticulously maintained, and the streets lined with trees that had been planted years earlier by the development company. On the outside, it looked like the kind of place where problems didn't exist. But anyone who has ever lived under the watchful eye of a homeowners association knows that appearances can be deceiving. The HOA in this neighborhood prided itself on rules. There was a rule for everything: the height of your grass, the color of your shutters, even how long you could leave your trash bins at the curb. But as strict as the HOA was, nothing compared to one particular resident who had, over the years, developed a reputation for making life miserable for everyone else. Her name was Karen. Karen wasn't just any HOA stickler. She was the self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics. She didn't hold an official title on the HOA board, but that never stopped her from acting as though she ran the place. She saw herself as the enforcer, constantly patrolling the street, pointing out supposed violations, and reporting neighbors for the smallest of infractions. To most, she was simply unbearable. The trouble began in early December, when the first hints of Christmas spirit started appearing on porches and rooftops. For years, the main character, let's call him David, had enjoyed decorating his house for the holidays. He wasn't the type to go overboard. A few strands of lights around the windows, a glowing reindeer on the lawn, and a wreath on the door were usually enough. It was simple, tasteful, and something that brought joy to his family. But this year was different. This year, David decided to expand a little. He bought a few more strands of lights, added a second reindeer to the display, and even invested in a string of twinkling icicle lights to drape across his roofline. It wasn't excessive. It was cheerful, festive, and far from being the brightest house on the block. At least, that's what he thought. Within 2 days of putting up the decorations, the first sign of trouble arrived. A neatly folded letter appeared in his mailbox, typed in an all-too-familiar tone. It was from the HOA, or so it claimed. The letter stated that his decorations were too distracting and not in line with community standards. David had lived in the neighborhood for years and knew the HOA's official guidelines. He also knew that nothing he had put up violated them. That's when he realized who was really behind the complaint. It had to be Karen. Karen's dislike of Christmas decorations wasn't new. Every year, she grumbled about neighbors who dared to hang up lights. She claimed they were tacky, that they ruined the look of the neighborhood, and that they attracted unwanted attention. The truth was simpler. Karen hated anything that brought joy to others if she couldn't control it. At first, David brushed off the letter. He had no intention of taking down his decorations, especially since he hadn't broken a single rule. But Karen wasn't one to give up easily. Over the next few days, she began her usual tactics. She stood at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at his house every evening when the lights flickered on. She whispered to passing neighbors, trying to recruit them to her side. And, of course, she filed more complaints with the HOA, demanding that something be done. David stayed calm, but his frustration grew. Each night, as his lights twinkled softly, he noticed Karen's curtain twitch. She was always watching, always waiting, and slowly, it became less about the decorations themselves and more about a test of wills. Karen wanted control, and David wasn't about to let her have it. By the second week of December, the situation escalated. Another letter arrived, this one threatening fines if the decorations weren't removed immediately. But when David contacted the HOA directly, he discovered that no such fines had been approved. The so-called official notice wasn't from the HOA board at all. It was Karen forging her own documents to intimidate him. That was the final straw. David realized he had two choices. He could quietly take down his decorations and let Karen win, or he could fight back. And if there was one thing Karen hated more than Christmas lights, it was losing. That's when the idea struck him. If Karen thought his decorations were too bright now, what would she do if they were 10 times brighter? It was a mischievous thought at first, almost a joke he told himself to ease the irritation. But the more he considered it, the more appealing it became. He started researching lighting setups, outdoor displays, and legal limits for neighborhood decorations. If he played it smart, he could stay within the HOA rules and still make Karen absolutely miserable. As he scrolled through websites selling professional-grade LED lights, projectors, and yard inflatables, his plans started to take shape. This wasn't just going to be a small act of defiance. This was going to be a show, but it wouldn't happen overnight. If David was going to pull this off, he needed a plan, and more importantly, he needed time. Karen had made her move, and now it was his turn. The countdown to the ultimate Christmas light display had begun, and Karen had no idea what was coming. The seed of resistance had been planted, and now it began to grow. David couldn't shake the thought of outsmarting Karen with a light show so dazzling that the entire neighborhood would talk about it for years. She had crossed the line when she tried to intimidate him with forged HOA letters. This wasn't just about Christmas lights anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who thrived on controlling others. Over the next several days, David quietly worked on his plan. By day, he went about his routine as if nothing had changed, waving to neighbors, keeping his lawn tidy, and appearing perfectly ordinary. But at night, once the house was quiet, he spent hours scrolling through online catalogs, comparing options for lights, projectors, timers, and decorations. He wasn't going to just add a few extra bulbs. He was going to transform his house into the brightest spectacle the neighborhood had ever seen. The challenge was making sure it was all perfectly legal. Karen was just waiting for him to slip up so she could pounce. Overboard and violated an HOA rule, she'd win. But David had done his homework. The HOA guidelines were strict, but they had loopholes. Decorations were allowed as long as they were removed by mid-January. Lights couldn't spill directly into another resident's windows. And noise restrictions only applied to loud music after 10 p.m. Armed with that knowledge, David carefully mapped out his display. He ordered high-efficiency LED lights, hundreds of feet of them, that used minimal electricity but packed a blinding punch. He found programmable timers that would allow him to choreograph the lights into patterns and sequences. He even purchased a few discrete projectors that could cast shimmering snowflakes across the walls of his house. The more he planned, the more excited he became. This wasn't just petty revenge anymore. It was art. Meanwhile, Karen's obsession deepened. Every evening, as David's modest light display continued to glow, she hovered by her window or lingered in her yard, scowling. She had grown used to winning battles in the neighborhood. If she complained about someone's lawn, they mowed it. If she griped about trash cans, people dragged them back faster. But David's quiet refusal to bend infuriated her. The more she glared, the less he seemed to notice. But David noticed everything. He saw her standing at her window, clutching her coffee mug, eyes narrowed into slits. He saw her scribbling notes in a little pad she carried, no doubt documenting every flicker of light she could later twist into a complaint. He even caught her taking pictures of his house one evening, her phone snapping away in the dark. She was preparing for war, but she didn't know David was preparing too. The deliveries started arriving in early December, one by one. First came a box filled with strands of LED lights, carefully disguised among regular holiday packages. Then came the projectors, delivered late in the evening. David carried them into his garage without fanfare. Finally, the piece de resistance arrived, a massive inflatable snow globe complete with swirling artificial snow inside. It was gaudy, over the top, and perfect. He stored everything in his garage, biding his time. If he put everything up too early, Karen would know what was coming. He wanted to strike at the perfect moment, close enough to Christmas that she couldn't stop him, but early enough for the neighborhood to enjoy the spectacle. As he waited, Karen grew bolder. She left another typed letter in his mailbox, this one claiming that his lights were causing traffic hazards because people were slowing down to look at them. It was laughable. His display was barely noticeable compared to houses just a few blocks away. Still, she acted as though his modest string of icicle lights was a Las Vegas casino sign. The real turning point came one frosty evening when David overheard Karen cornering a group of neighbors at the mailbox cluster. She was loudly proclaiming that certain people were ruining the neighborhood with their excessive decorations. She hinted that she was considering escalating the issue to the county if the HOA refused to act. The neighbors nodded politely, but their expressions betrayed them. They weren't on her side. If anything, they were tired of her constant complaints. That was when David realized something crucial. The neighborhood wasn't just passively watching. They were waiting for someone to finally stand up to Karen. And he was ready to be that someone. The week before Christmas, he began the transformation. Quietly at first, an extra strand of lights one night, a glowing reindeer on the lawn the next. He wanted Karen to think this was the extent of it, just small additions. She noticed, of course. Each time something new appeared, she could be seen marching across her driveway, phone in hand, snapping more pictures. But then came the big reveal. On December 18th, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the neighborhood fell into its usual evening quiet, David flipped the switch. Instantly, his house erupted into a symphony of lights. Thousands of LEDs lit up in perfect synchronization, tracing every outline of his home. The projectors cast glittering snowflakes that danced across the siding. The inflatable snow globe inflated proudly on the lawn, glowing from within. And as a final touch, the reindeer sparkled as though galloping across a snowy field. The street lit up like never before. Neighbors poured out of their homes, laughing, cheering, and taking videos on their phones. Kids squealed with delight as they pointed at the massive snow globe. Cars slowed down, not because of any hazard, but because the sight was too stunning to pass without a glance. And then there was Karen. She stormed out of her house, her face twisted in rage, her phone raised as she recorded the display. She shouted into the night, waving her arms as if she could block the lights with sheer willpower. But her voice was drowned out by the joy of the crowd, the laughter of children, and the sparkling glow of David's masterpiece. David watched from his porch, a quiet smile on his face. He hadn't broken a single rule. Every decoration was permitted. Every light was within the guidelines. And yet, he had created something so powerful, so undeniably festive, that it turned the neighborhood against Karen in an instant. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't going to let this go. If anything, his victory tonight would only fuel her obsession further. And in the back of his mind, David wondered just how far she would go to try and stop him. The night of the grand reveal sent ripples through the neighborhood. David's home had transformed into the crown jewel of the street, a beacon of holiday spirit that people couldn't stop talking about. Cars began driving slowly down the block just to see the display. Children tugged their parents' hands, begging to walk by and stare at the glowing snow globe. Even the most stoic neighbors, those who rarely waved or smiled, couldn't help but pause and admire the spectacle. But not everyone was impressed. From across the street, Karen seethed. What was supposed to be a small victory for her, the removal of a few excessive lights, had turned into the ultimate humiliation. Not only had David refused to comply, he had defied her in the most public way possible. Each cheer from the crowd, each passing car that slowed to take a video, felt like a dagger to her pride. And worst of all, the more the neighborhood admired his decorations, the less they listened to her. Karen had always thrived on control. She manipulated the HOA, bullied neighbors, and weaponized the rulebook to get her way. But for the first time in years, her authority was crumbling, and she wasn't about to let that happen quietly. The very next morning, while frost still clung to the grass, Karen marched to David's house. She didn't bother to knock. Instead, she paced on the sidewalk, waving her phone and snapping pictures from every angle. She zoomed in on the lights, the snow globe, the projectors, anything she thought could be used as evidence. She muttered to herself, her breath visible in the cold air, her face twisted in determination. By noon, another letter appeared in David's mailbox. This one was longer, filled with legal jargon copied and pasted from somewhere online. It accused him of creating light pollution, claimed his decorations were a public safety hazard, and threatened to escalate the matter to local authorities. The letter wasn't signed by the HOA board. It wasn't even official. It was just another one of Karen's desperate attempts to scare him into submission. But David wasn't rattled. He had anticipated this. He read the letter, smiled, and tucked it away with the others. His plan had never been about just putting up lights. It had been about breaking Karen's hold over the neighborhood. And, judging by the growing support from his neighbors, it was working. Still, Karen wasn't done. Over the following days, her behavior grew more erratic. She began pacing in front of his house every evening, recording long videos on her phone as though she was gathering evidence for a court case. She filed multiple complaints with the HOA, each one more dramatic than the last. She even called the non-emergency police line, claiming that David's lights were distracting drivers and could cause an accident. When the police finally did show up, they didn't see a problem. The officers admired the lights, noted that nothing violated city ordinances, and politely told Karen there was nothing they could do. As they left, one of them even complimented David on the display, chuckling at the massive snow globe. That humiliation cut deep. For Karen, it was no longer just about the lights. It was about power. She had lost control of the narrative, and in her mind, that was unacceptable. The next phase of her campaign was sabotage. It started subtly. One evening, David noticed that a section of lights along the bushes had gone dark. At first, he assumed it was a technical glitch, but when he inspected them, he found the wires had been deliberately cut. Not chewed by an animal, not frayed by weather, cut clean with a blade. He replaced them quietly, not saying a word. A few nights later, one of the projectors was knocked over, its lens cracked. Again, David fixed it without fuss. He didn't confront Karen, didn't make accusations, didn't even mention it to the HOA. He knew exactly who was behind it, but he also knew she thrived on attention. The less he reacted, the more frustrated she would become. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued to rally around him. Families came by to take pictures. Neighbors brought hot cocoa to sip while watching the lights flicker, and one family even suggested starting an annual tradition of decorating the block. Karen watched all of this unfold, trapped inside her own bitterness, her attempts at sabotage failing to dim the joy surrounding David's display. But then, she crossed the line. On December 21st, David woke early to find his inflatable snow globe deflated on the lawn, its fabric slashed in multiple places. The swirling artificial snow inside had spilled onto the frosty grass, glistening like tiny shards of glass in the morning sun. It wasn't a malfunction, and it wasn't an accident. Someone had attacked it. Neighbors quickly gathered, shaking their heads in disbelief. Everyone knew who was responsible, though no one had seen her do it. Karen, of course, denied everything. She stood in her yard, arms folded, insisting she had nothing to do with it. But her smug expression told another story. She thought she had finally won. David didn't react, not in the way she expected. He didn't scream, didn't accuse, didn't storm across the street demanding answers. Instead, he calmly collected the remains of the snow globe and carried them into his garage. To anyone else, it looked like defeat. But inside, David was already thinking 2 steps ahead. Karen thought she had silenced his display. What she didn't realize was that the snow globe had only been one part of his plan. Christmas was only a few days away, and if Karen believed she had seen the worst of his decorations, she was in for the shock of her life. Because David wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The destruction of the snow globe could have been the breaking point. For many people, seeing a beloved decoration slashed open would have been enough to throw in the towel. That's exactly what Karen wanted, to prove she could intimidate and sabotage her way to victory. But what Karen didn't realize was that David had anticipated her moves. From the very start, he knew she wouldn't just stop at complaints and forged letters. He knew she'd escalate, and he had prepared for it. The snow globe wasn't his centerpiece. It was bait, a distraction, something for her to fixate on while he worked behind the scenes on something much bigger. While neighbors shook their heads in sympathy and muttered about Karen's pettiness, David remained calm. He reassured everyone that it was no big deal, that he had backups, that he wasn't going to let one act of vandalism ruin Christmas. And then, quietly, he went back to work. In his garage sat several unopened boxes that he had been saving for the right moment. Inside were professional-grade LED floodlights, powerful enough to bathe an entire house in dazzling color. He had also ordered synchronized controllers, the kind that could coordinate lights with music. For weeks, he had been testing them in secret, making sure everything would run smoothly. Now it was time to unleash them. On December 23rd, just 2 nights before Christmas, David spent the entire day setting up the final phase of his plan. He climbed ladders, ran extension cords, and carefully positioned the floodlights to cover every angle of his house. He mounted new projectors, stronger than the last, and connected them to the controllers. He even rigged his sound system, not blaring, but loud enough to carry festive music through the crisp winter air. By the time the sun set, everything was ready. The neighborhood gathered once again, curious to see how David would respond to the snow globe's destruction. Many expected a smaller display, maybe a replacement decoration or two. Even Karen lingered in her driveway, arms crossed, convinced she had already won. And then, with a single flick of the switch, the house came alive. The entire property erupted in color. Floodlights bathed the walls in brilliant reds, greens, and golds, shifting seamlessly from one to the next. Strings of lights pulsed in perfect rhythm, chasing each other around the roofline and windows. Projected snowflakes swirled across the siding, brighter and sharper than before. And then, just as the crowd gasped in awe, the music began. Synchronized to a cheerful holiday tune, the lights danced. They flashed, twinkled, and rippled in patterns that matched every beat of the song. The house wasn't just decorated, it was performing. Children screamed with delight, clapping and jumping in place. Parents pulled out their phones, recording every second. Cars lined the street, their headlights off as drivers parked to watch the show. For 15 glorious minutes, David's house became the centerpiece of the entire neighborhood, maybe even the entire town. And Karen? She was livid. She shouted from her yard, her voice drowned out by the music. She waved her arms, pointing furiously at the display as if anyone cared. She even tried to flag down a passing car, gesturing wildly for them to leave, but the driver just rolled down the window and gave her a thumbs up before filming the lights. Her fury only intensified when David unveiled the finale. As the song reached its climax, the house blazed with every color at once, brighter than anyone thought possible, before fading into a gentle glow of white twinkling lights. It was magical, breathtaking, and completely within the HOA's guidelines. Karen had nothing, no rule to cite, no violation to claim. He had beaten her at her own game, and she knew it. But the battle wasn't over. Later that night, long after the crowd had dispersed and the lights dimmed, Karen paced in her kitchen. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling as she scrolled through her phone. She replayed the videos neighbors had already uploaded online, each one a reminder of her humiliation. Her control over the neighborhood was slipping, and the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She drafted emails to the HOA board, filling them with exaggerated complaints about noise, traffic, and safety hazards. She called the county offices, leaving rambling voicemails about light pollution and property values. She even threatened to contact the local news, claiming the display was causing chaos in the neighborhood. But every attempt failed. The HOA reminded her that David's decorations were allowed. The county dismissed her calls, and the news, if anything, seemed more likely to feature the lights as a feel-good holiday story than as a scandal. Desperation consumed her. On Christmas Eve, she made her boldest move yet. Around midnight, while the street was quiet and most families were asleep, Karen crept across the road. Dressed in dark clothes, she carried a pair of scissors and a roll of black tape. Her plan was simple: cut the power cords, tape over the lights, and ruin the show before Christmas morning. But Karen had underestimated David once again. Anticipating her sabotage, he had installed small security cameras around his property. The moment she stepped onto his lawn, the cameras captured everything. Her crouching near the cords, her scissors glinting in the moonlight, her frantic attempts to dismantle the setup. And just when she thought she had succeeded, when she yanked on a cord and caused one section of lights to flicker off, the rest of the display kept glowing. David had planned for redundancy. Multiple power sources, backup controllers. Nothing short of a full-scale blackout could stop his lights. Defeated, Karen scrambled back to her house, unaware that the entire neighborhood now had proof of her actions. The following morning, as families gathered to exchange gifts and children ran outside to admire the glowing house, David calmly reviewed the footage. He didn't rush to confront her. He didn't post it online or call the police yet. He simply saved it, knowing it was his ace in the hole. Because if Karen thought she could get away with sabotage, she was about to learn that her biggest humiliation was still to come. Christmas morning arrived, and with it, a sense of joy that spread across the entire neighborhood. Families spilled out of their homes, children clutching new toys while parents carried mugs of coffee to keep warm in the cold air. The street was alive with laughter and cheer, and at the center of it all was David's house, still glowing, still magnificent, still the crown jewel of the block. Despite Karen's late-night sabotage attempt, the lights held strong. They twinkled in gentle whites and soft blues that morning, a calmer display that perfectly fit the peaceful holiday mood. Neighbors snapped pictures, cars once again slowed to admire the scene, and everyone seemed united in one simple truth. David's house had brought the neighborhood together. But beneath that joy simmered another story, one only David knew. While others celebrated, he reviewed the footage captured by his security cameras. There she was, Karen, creeping across his lawn in the dead of night, scissors in hand, cutting cords with a look of frantic determination. The evidence was undeniable. For a while, David considered keeping it to himself. After all, Christmas was meant for peace, not conflict. But as he watched Karen strut around her yard that morning, sipping from her mug as if nothing had happened, he realized something. Silence would only enable her. She had terrorized the neighborhood for too long. She had lied, manipulated, and sabotaged, all while hiding behind fake authority. And now she had been caught. The time had come to expose her. That afternoon, David invited a few neighbors over. They gathered in his driveway, sipping hot chocolate and chatting about the lights. Once the group was settled, he pulled out his phone. Calmly, without fanfare, he pressed play. The video spoke for itself. Karen crouched in the shadows. Karen, scissors in hand. Karen, slashing the cords with deliberate precision. The neighbors watched in silence at first, their eyes widening, their mouths dropping open. Then came the murmurs, shocked whispers, angry mutterings, a few outright gasps. It didn't take long for the video to spread. By evening, nearly the entire neighborhood had seen it. Phones buzzed with notifications as residents shared the footage with one another. Screens lit up in kitchens and living rooms as families watched in disbelief. Even those who had once tolerated Karen's antics couldn't deny the truth staring them in the face. Karen had gone too far. By the following day, the whispers had turned into open conversations. Neighbors stood in groups at the mailbox cluster, shaking their heads and venting their frustrations. Stories poured out. How Karen had harassed them over trivial issues, how she had threatened fines, how she had manipulated the HOA into enforcing rules that suited her alone. For years, she had ruled the neighborhood through fear and intimidation. But now the mask was gone, and Karen knew it. She could feel the shift in the air. Where once people avoided her out of caution, now they ignored her out of disdain. Where once her words carried weight, now they were dismissed as noise. When she marched down the street to confront David about the harassment she claimed he was causing, no one backed her up. Instead, neighbors watched from their porches, arms folded, faces set in quiet defiance. Karen had lost her audience, but she wasn't about to give up. The HOA board received a flood of complaints, not about David's lights, but about Karen herself. Residents demanded action, pointing to the video as proof that she had crossed the line. They accused her of damaging property, of forging letters, of creating constant strife in what was supposed to be a peaceful community. The board, long used to her relentless pressure, suddenly found themselves under pressure of a different kind. Karen, in response, doubled down. She flooded the HOA inbox with her own emails, insisting the video was fake, claiming David had staged the footage to frame her. She threatened lawsuits, promised to call in lawyers, and even hinted at reporting the entire neighborhood for harassment. But her words rang hollow. The video was too clear, the evidence too strong. The final blow came during a neighborhood gathering just after Christmas. Someone, no one admitted to it, but everyone suspected, had set up a projector against their garage door and played the footage of Karen's sabotage for all to see. Dozens of neighbors stood in the cold, watching the scene unfold in larger-than-life detail. Karen, dressed in black, scissors flashing under the moonlight. Karen, crouching low, her face twisted with frustration. Karen, caught red-handed. The crowd's reaction was swift. Laughter mixed with outrage. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others openly mocked her. Parents pointed to the screen, telling their children that this was what happened when people made bad choices. And Karen? She stood frozen in her yard, red-faced, shouting at the crowd to stop. She screamed that it was illegal, that it was defamation, that they would all regret mocking her. But no one listened. For the first time, her voice carried no power. David watched quietly from his porch, sipping his cocoa, saying nothing. He didn't need to. The neighborhood was speaking for him. The balance of power had shifted. That night, as the projector was packed away and families returned to their homes, a sense of unity settled over the block. People who had once lived in silent fear of Karen now felt free. They joked, they laughed, they shared stories. And at the center of it all, David's house glowed softly, a symbol of defiance and resilience. But while most believed the matter was settled, David knew better. Karen wasn't finished. He could see it in her eyes, the way she glared at him from across the street, the way she muttered under her breath when neighbors ignored her. She had been exposed, humiliated, and stripped of her influence. And that made her dangerous, because people like Karen didn't fade quietly into the background. They lashed out, and David knew her final move was coming. The week after Christmas was always a quiet one in the neighborhood. The frenzy of shopping had passed. Families were home enjoying new gifts, and the glow of holiday lights lingered like an afterthought. But this year, the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful, it was tense. Everyone knew Karen was plotting something. She had been humiliated, not once, but repeatedly. Her complaints ignored, her sabotage exposed, her reputation shattered in front of the entire community. For years, she had controlled the street with intimidation and petty rules. Now, no one listened. No one feared her, and Karen couldn't stand it. In the days following her public exposure, she grew restless. Neighbors noticed her pacing along her driveway, making long phone calls in an increasingly agitated tone. Packages arrived at her door. Thick envelopes, clipboards, binders full of papers. She was arming herself with what she thought was her last weapon: bureaucracy. Karen's plan was simple in her mind. If she couldn't beat David with complaints or sabotage, she would bury him under legal threats. She compiled every possible accusation: property damage, noise complaints, public disturbance, even emotional distress. She highlighted vague sections of the HOA guidelines, twisting them into something they weren't. And then, one morning, she marched to David's door and shoved a thick manila envelope into his mailbox. Inside was a letter, pages of rambling accusations, threats of lawsuits, demands for immediate removal of the lights, and a declaration that she would take this matter to the highest authority. It wasn't an official legal document, but it was meant to scare him into submission. David, however, wasn't rattled. He read it calmly, sipped his coffee, and then set it aside. Because unlike Karen, David had the truth and evidence on his side. He had the video of her sabotage. He had witnesses who had seen her pacing his lawn and photographing his decorations. He even had emails from the HOA board confirming his display was within the rules. And while Karen wasted her time with empty threats, David had been quietly building his own case. That afternoon, he called the HOA president. He forwarded the video. He forwarded the fake letters she had placed in his mailbox. He forwarded copies of the threatening messages she had sent. And when the board reviewed everything, the response was swift. For years, Karen had been a thorn in their side, pestering them with constant demands and complaints. But now, they had undeniable proof of her misconduct, proof they couldn't ignore. The following day, a notice was delivered, not to David, but to Karen. It outlined her violations: harassment of a neighbor, forgery of HOA documents, and vandalism of private property. She was fined heavily, warned of further legal action, and informed that she was officially banned from participating in any HOA matters for the foreseeable future. The news spread quickly. Neighbors watched from their windows as Karen tore open the envelope and read the letter, her face twisting with disbelief. She screamed, waving the papers in the air, shouting that it was unfair, that it was all a conspiracy against her. But this time no one cared. No one came to her defense. No one listened. By New Year's Eve, the shift was complete. The same neighbors who once avoided confrontation now openly laughed about Karen's downfall. They toasted to David's victory, to the lights that had brought them together, to the end of an era of fear. Children ran freely in the street again without Karen's constant scolding. Families planned block parties without worrying about her interference. The neighborhood, for the first time in years, felt united. And David? He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had stood his ground, fought with patience and cleverness, and won. On the night of December 31st, he set up one final show. Not as bright as before, not as loud, but beautiful in its simplicity. Strings of lights shimmered in white and gold. The projectors cast soft patterns of falling snow, and gentle music played as neighbors gathered in the street to welcome the new year. As the clock struck midnight, cheers rang out. Fireworks popped in the distance. Families hugged, children laughed, and the glow of David's house stood as a symbol of victory, not just over Karen, but over the negativity she had brought into their lives for so long. Across the street, Karen's house sat in darkness. Curtains drawn, lights off, silence pressing against the walls. She had retreated inward, isolated and bitter, her reign of control finally broken. The neighborhood had moved on, and as David stood on his porch, watching the joy spread across the block, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Karen hated his Christmas lights, so he made them 10 times brighter. And in the end, it wasn't just the lights that won. It was the spirit of standing up, of refusing to bow to a bully, of showing that sometimes the best revenge is not anger, but joy. Because nothing, not even Karen, could dim that glow.